The rain had not stopped for hours. Seattle was known for its gray skies and persistent drizzle, but that night, the storm felt heavier than usual, like the city itself was mourning. Richard Yamada adjusted the collar of his trench coat as he stepped out of his parked Lexus, the wiper blades ticking in rhythm like an anxious heartbeat. He had no reason to be in that part of town, at that hour. He'd taken a wrong turn after an unplanned detour from his regular grocery store. But something had compelled him to keep driving, as if someone, was waiting to be found. Under the I-5 overpass, his headlights caught movement. A small figure. No, 3. He pulled over slowly, heart thrumming. The street was deserted. Water pooled along the sidewalk. He stepped out, letting the cold soak into his shoes. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, sat curled up on a piece of flattened cardboard. Her clothes were soaked through. In her arms, tightly swaddled in thin blankets, were 2 infants, twins by the look of it, but frail and deathly still. "Hey," Richard said, lowering his voice, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't speak. Her eyes met his for a moment, large, dark, hollow with exhaustion and something older than her years. Then she looked away, clutching the babies tighter. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, slowly kneeling. "It's freezing out here. You can stay." The girl blinked, shivering, but said nothing. He noticed her lips were blue at the edges. One of the infants whimpered, a sound so soft it barely rose above the rain. He took off his coat, wrapping it gently around her shoulders. She flinched at first, then stilled. Something cracked in his chest as he watched her cradle the babies instinctively, no older than 10, and yet she protected them with the desperation of someone who knew too well what it meant to lose everything. "Let me help you," Richard said. "I have a car. It's warm. You don't have to say anything." Still, the girl didn't respond. But when he stood and extended his hand, she didn't pull away. She stood slowly, swaying with fatigue, and followed him to the car. Inside, the heater blared. He handed her a bottle of water from the console and a protein bar from his briefcase. She unwrapped it with shaking hands and took cautious bites, feeding tiny morsels to the babies. They sucked weakly, barely responsive. Richard's fingers hovered over his phone. He thought about calling the police, Child Protective Services, a hospital. But something about the girl's eyes made him hesitate. She was terrified, not just of strangers, but of what would happen next. So he drove. Not home, not yet. To a nearby urgent care clinic still open late. He used his name, his status, his tone of command, what remained of his once powerful voice in corporate boardrooms, to get them seen immediately. The babies were examined first. Dehydrated. Mildly hypothermic. Underweight. But no signs of abuse. The girl was next. No physical injuries. Severely malnourished. When asked her name, she whispered, "Emma." "Last name?" the nurse asked. Emma looked away. Back at Richard's house, silence reigned. The modern glass and steel structure sat high above Lake Washington, but inside, it felt like a mausoleum. Polished surfaces. Framé d'awards. A piano no one played anymore. Richard hadn't brought anyone home in years. Not since the accident. He had lost his younger brother, Daniel, and Daniel's wife, Evelyn, in a car crash on I-405 6 years earlier. The crash had been violent, fiery. Their infant daughter, Ellie, had never been found. The authorities presumed she had perished, thrown from the vehicle, her body never recovered. For Richard, it had been the final severing of the only real family tie he had left. He buried himself in philanthropy and corporate consulting, but the grief never dulled. Now here he was, standing in his living room, watching a silent little girl and 2 newborns sleep on his leather couch, wrapped in blankets brought down from the guest rooms. He should call someone. It wasn't legal, what he was doing. Taking in a child, 3 really, without going through the system. But the thought of them back on the street, in a shelter, separated, it was unbearable. The next morning, he called an old friend, Dr. Samantha Liu, a pediatrician and former foster care advocate. He told her everything, almost ashamed at the way his voice cracked describing Emma's stillness, the baby's pale fingers. "You can't keep them, Richard," she said gently. "Not like this. You need to report it." "I will. I just need time." "You could be charged." "I know." Silence. Then,
et l'aile comme ovaire.
Today. Let me examine them. He agreed. When Samantha arrived, she checked the babies, identical in appearance, possibly not in genetics. She noted their vitals, gave recommendations, left a list of pediatricians and social workers. But it was Emma she spent the most time with. In the kitchen, sipping cocoa, Emma finally spoke more than one word. She didn't know her last name. She didn't know where she came from. She had been with a woman she called Mama Beth for as long as she could remember, until one day Mama Beth left and never came back. She didn't remember her real parents. Just fire and screaming, and a name whispered in her sleep, Ellie. Samantha looked at Richard with something between awe and disbelief. You need to get a DNA test. Richard stared at her.
You think? Just do it.
He did. Quietly, through a private lab. The results would take 5 days. In those days, life inside Richard's home shifted. He installed a crib in one of the guest rooms. A soft lullaby played in the evenings. Emma began drawing again, faces without names, places without location. Richard cooked for the first time in years. He even found himself smiling once. On the 5th morning, the results arrived in a plain white envelope. He opened it alone, standing in his study. Result: probability of avuncular relationship, 99.97%. Emma was Ellie, his niece, his brother's daughter. She had survived. And now she was here, in his house,
Alive.
But the hardest part was yet to come. Because someone somewhere had tried to erase her. And Richard would not let that stand. The snow came late to Seattle that year, falling in soft flurries that dusted the rooftops and blurred the skyline behind veils of white. Inside the house on Lake Washington, however, it was warm.
Firelight flickered in the hearth.
The scent of miso soup, faint and comforting, lingered in the kitchen air. And for the first time in years, Richard Yamada felt something unfamiliar settle over his chest, a stillness, but not from loneliness. From presence. Emma Noelle was sitting cross-legged on the floor, gently rocking one of the infants, now called Max, while the other, whom Richard had named Lily, slept in the crib nearby. She was patient, methodical, far more competent than any 9-year-old had the right to be. You're good with them, Richard said from the armchair, watching her.
Ellie shrugged, not looking up.
They're good babies. Richard wanted to ask so much. About Mama Beth. About how she'd ended up under that overpass. About the years she couldn't remember, or refused to. But the counselor Samantha had warned him not to push. Children with trauma didn't heal through interrogation. They healed through consistency, safety, and time. So he waited. He watched.
Et protected.
On the 6th day after the DNA results confirmed Ellie's identity, he called a meeting with his attorney, Charles Brenton, a silver-haired man who'd helped build the Yamada family trust 3 decades ago. I want to apply for guardianship, Richard said, sitting across from him in the study. Charles raised an eyebrow. Of Ellie. Of all 3 children. The lawyer leaned back in his chair. You realize that 2 of those children have no confirmed identity, no medical records, no birth certificates? I realize they're alive. That they've been under the care of a 9-year-old girl on the streets. And I also realize that if I don't act, the system will separate them.
Possibly forever.
Charles nodded slowly. And you believe Ellie is your niece? I don't believe it. I know it. We did a private DNA test. It's her. Then you'll need to formalize that in court. A judge will ask for verified lab results, documentation, and potentially testimony. I'm prepared for that.
And the other 2?
I don't care who they belong to biologically. For now, they belong with her. Charles tapped a pen against his notepad, thoughtful. This won't be a quiet process. You're high profile. Once this hits the docket, it could become media bait. And if someone with more legal standing comes forward. No one will, Richard said, his voice firm. If there were family, they would have come by now. After the meeting, Richard returned to the living room where Ellie was reading aloud to the babies from a picture book. She was soft-spoken, her voice carrying that peculiar cadence children use when speaking to those even smaller than themselves. Hey, he said gently, how would you feel about staying here longer? Ellie looked up. Her eyes were still haunted, but something else stirred in them, hope perhaps.
Just me and the babies.
And me, he added. I'd like you to stay. All of you. She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Okay. That night, while Ellie slept curled beside Lily's crib, Richard sat at his desk filling out paperwork, applications for emergency guardianship, forms for birth certificate replacement, hospital consent, immunization records. He was up past midnight, but he didn't care. There was a rhythm to this kind of work, a purpose he hadn't felt since the accident. The next morning brought something else, an envelope on the doorstep.
No return address.
Inside, a single sheet of paper with a printed message. You're not her father.
Walk away before you lose everything.
Richard stared at it for a long moment. The message was unsigned, typed, cold. The threats, he realized, were beginning. He didn't show Ellie. Didn't mention it to Samantha or even Charles. He stored the letter in a locked drawer and doubled the security around the property. Cameras.
Motion sensor.
A security firm on call. Whoever had taken Ellie after the crash, whoever had tried to erase her existence, they knew she was back. That night, Richard had a nightmare for the first time in years. In it, the car crash replayed in reverse, twisted metal reforming, flames freezing mid-air, the sound of a baby crying from somewhere far away, unreachable. He woke gasping, sweat pooling at his collar. He went to the nursery. All 3 children were safe, asleep. He exhaled. 2 days later, Child Protective Services called. Someone had filed a complaint. Allegations of unauthorized custody of minors and endangerment. The agent assigned to the case, a woman named Clara Morris, arrived that afternoon. Middle-aged, firm but not unkind. She wore a gray peacoat and carried a leather folder. Mr. Yamada, she said as she stepped inside, this is just a preliminary visit. Someone raised concerns. I have to follow protocol. Richard nodded. Of course. He explained everything. The DNA results. The medical visits. The legal filings in progress. He introduced her to Ellie, who spoke little but answered questions politely. She showed the baby's room, the stocked pantry, the emergency contact list. Clara took notes. She didn't smile, but neither did she frown. As she prepared to leave, she said, "This house is well maintained. The children appear safe. But the law still requires court authorization. Until then, your guardianship is provisional."
Understood.
She hesitated, then added, "Not many people would do what you're doing." "I didn't plan on it," Richard said. "But once you see a child on the street, holding 2 newborns in a storm, you don't walk away." Clara nodded. "We'll be in touch." As the door closed behind her, Richard felt the weight return, not fear but resolve. The system was watching now. Which meant whoever had tried to make Ellie disappear might try again. This time, he'd be ready. That evening, as snow fell gently outside and the fire crackled low, Ellie came into his study. "Baba," she said, a word she hadn't used before.
That is what you said to call my dad. Can he call you that?
Richard looked at her, stunned. Then slowly, he smiled. "Yes," he said. "You can." And just like that, something shifted. Not just between them, but in the air, in the walls, in the silence.
The house had begun to breathe again.
And Richard knew, they had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The days began to stretch longer as the grip of winter slowly eased. In the Yamada home, however, time moved with a different rhythm, measured not by calendars, but by bottle feedings, nap schedules, and the cautious unfolding of a young girl's trust. Ellie had stopped flinching when someone entered the room. She started humming while helping with the twins, her voice soft and almost always off-key. And Richard, for his part, had grown used to the weight of a sleeping infant against his shoulder, the nighttime cries echoing down the hallway, and the quiet presence of a child rediscovering what safety felt like. But nothing, not even peace, lasted without friction. On the 3rd Monday of February, the phone call came. "Richard," said Charles Brenton on the other end, his tone sharper than usual, "we have a problem." Richard was in the middle of preparing formula in the kitchen. "Go on." "Your emergency guardianship application has been flagged. Someone's filed a formal challenge."
Richard froze.
"Who?" Name listed is Nathaniel Cross. Richard's stomach turned.
Nathan?
Yes. He's petitioned for full custody of Ellie, claiming he's her legal guardian by virtue of an arrangement made with Bethany Doyle, also known as Mama Beth. Richard dropped the bottle into the sink. That woman who left Ellie under a bridge is now the source of his claim? That's what his lawyers are arguing. That Mama Beth was Ellie's de facto guardian for years and that she transferred guardianship rights to Cross in writing before she disappeared. That's ridiculous. She had no legal claim to Ellie, and he certainly doesn't. I agree. But the judge won't. Not without evidence. Richard ran a hand through his hair. This is about the twins too, isn't it? Not yet. Cross's petition only names Ellie. But you can bet he's building a case on the others. Richard exhaled, steadying himself. What's the next step? You'll need to appear in court. 2 weeks. Prepare everything, DNA test results, records of care, character witnesses, any information you can gather on Bethany Doyle. After the call ended, Richard walked to the living room, where Ellie was sitting on the floor with Max and Lily. She looked up as he entered, her smile faltering. Is something wrong, Baba? He crouched beside her, placing a hand gently on her back. Someone's trying to take you away from me, sweetheart. But I promise you, I'm going to fight this. With everything I have. Ellie blinked slowly. Is it the man with the black car? Richard's breath caught. What black car? She hesitated. When I was with Mama Beth, he'd come sometimes. He wore suits. He smelled like smoke. She called him Mr. C. He always brought envelopes. Richard's mind spun. Nathan Cross. Cigars. Suits. Money. It fit. Do you remember anything else? Where they met? What they talked about? Ellie shook her head. I had to stay in the other room. But one time, I peeked. She gave him a paper. He gave her a bag. Then she told me we were moving. That was the beginning of it, Richard realized, the day Bethany Doyle sold Ellie's future. That night, after the twins were asleep, Richard sat with his laptop and began digging. He searched public databases, court records, non-profit filings. Bethany Doyle's name was tied to multiple foster homes, religious shelters, and adoption intermediaries operating in the Pacific Northwest. None had licenses. All had either shut down or rebranded. But one document caught his eye, a tax filing from 2019 for a charity called Hope's Gate Ministries. The signatory?
Nathaniel Cross.
He forwarded the document to Charles with a short message. We need to prove he's profiting off these kids. By morning, Charles had responded. I have a contact at the Department of Social Services. We may be able to subpoena his financials. But it won't be easy. Or fast. Time, Richard knew, was not on their side. Meanwhile, Ellie began to open up in other ways. She started writing, short sentences, fragments of memory. One afternoon, she handed Richard a page from her notebook. There was a red barn.
A white fence.
Horses. We weren't allowed to talk at dinner. If you asked about your parents, you had to sleep in the cold room. It sent chills down his spine. These are real? He asked. She nodded. I didn't remember until Max cried at night. It sounded like the cold room. Where was this?
I don't know. Somewhere in the woods.
We moved a lot. Richard scanned the page again, his mind connecting invisible threads.
The cold room. The silence. The secrecy.
It wasn't just neglect. It was conditioning. Richard called Samantha Lou that evening and read her the note. She's been through systematic trauma, Samantha said.
This sounds like a rock group home.
Possibly part of a trafficking pipeline masked as foster care. Is there any way to trace it? We'd need law enforcement.
MEB fédéral.
This goes beyond state level. Richard's jaw tightened. I'll call them. You'll have to be careful, Richard. You're already under scrutiny.
I don't care.
Someone tried to erase this child. I want them to pay. On the eve of the custody hearing, a manila envelope arrived by courier.
No return address.
Inside were photographs.
Grainy, time-stamped.
Ellie, no Ellie, in the arms of a woman outside a dilapidated farmhouse. In another, Nathan Cross stood by a black SUV, accepting a clipboard from Bethany Doyle. There was no note. But the message was clear. Someone wanted Richard to know they were watching. He showed the pictures to Charles and Samantha the next morning. "This proves coordination between Doyle and Cross," Charles said. "But it also proves they're scared." Samantha nodded. "They're trying to rattle you." "It won't work," Richard said. Ellie entered the room, quiet as always, but with purpose in her steps. "I want to speak in court," she said. All three adults turned.
Richard knelt.
"Are you sure, Ellie? You don't have to." "I want to. If they try to lie about me, I want to tell the truth." Richard looked into her eyes. They no longer looked hollow. They looked ready. "You've already made me proud," he whispered. As they packed up for the courthouse, Richard folded the pictures, the DNA report, and Ellie's handwritten memories into a binder. He carried it like a shield. Tomorrow, they would enter a courtroom. Tomorrow, the ghosts of forgotten names would stand in judgment. And tomorrow, for the first time in 6 long years, Richard would speak for a child he had failed once, but not again. The courtroom was colder than Richard had expected. Not physically, it was well lit and climate-controlled, but emotionally.
Stérile. Unforgiving.
The kind of place where truth had to be argued, not simply shown. Ellie sat beside him at the petitioner's table, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore the navy blue dress Samantha had bought her, with white lace at the collar and sleeves. Her hair had been combed and pinned back. She looked like a child ready for a school recital, not a legal proceeding that might decide the fate of her life.
Across the S. le Sat Nathaniel Cross.
Richard hadn't seen him in over a decade. Back then, Nathan had been a mid-level executive, ambitious and oily, with a talent for masking greed as altruism. Now he was polished, confident, and if one didn't know better, almost respectable. His tailored suit, his silver cufflinks, the practiced nod he gave the judge all broadcast a man of means and discipline. But Richard knew better. He remembered how Nathan had manipulated donors through shady non-profit fronts, how he'd turned their joint charitable foundation into a shell game for corporate gain. Richard had cut ties when the allegations surfaced, and Nathan had quietly rebranded himself, moved to Arizona, and started again. Now here he was, claiming custody of the child Richard had just found again. The bailiff called the hearing to order. Judge Marianne Keene, a stern woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, presided over the bench. "Mr. Yamada," she began, "you're petitioning for emergency guardianship of the minor child, legally known as Ellie Mae Dawson. You claim to be her biological uncle." "Yes, Your Honor," Richard said. "I've submitted the DNA results proving that Ellie is the daughter of my late brother, Daniel Yamada." "And Mr. Cross," the judge turned, "you are contesting this petition?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nathan said smoothly. "While I don't deny Mr. Yamada's biological connection, I am here to assert that biology is not the sole determinant of guardianship. I was entrusted with Ellie's care by her previous guardian, Bethany Doyle, who raised her for over 6 years." The judge frowned. "Do you have legal documentation of this arrangement?" Nathan's lawyer stood. "We have a notarized affidavit signed by Ms. Doyle transferring guardianship rights to Mr. Cross, as well as receipts, photographs, and records of Ellie's residence over multiple years."
Richard leaned forward.
"Your Honor, with all due respect, Bethany Doyle had no legal guardianship over Ellie to begin with. She disappeared with the child after the death of my brother and sister-in-law. She never reported Ellie's presence to the authorities. She raised her off the grid, with no medical records, no schooling, and under highly suspicious conditions." The judge looked over her glasses. "Do you have evidence of this claim?" Richard opened the binder and passed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Included are the results of a DNA test confirming Ellie's identity, photographic evidence of Mr. Cross and Ms. Doyle engaging in what appears to be the unlawful transfer of the child, and Ellie's own written account of her time in an unlicensed group home run by Ms. Doyle. Judge Keene took her time flipping through the documents. Her expression remained unreadable. "Ms. Liu," the judge said next, turning to Samantha, who had been sworn in as a witness. "You've been involved in this case as a pediatric advisor. What can you tell the court about Ellie's well-being?"
Samantha stood.
"Ellie exhibits clear signs of long-term emotional trauma. She is developmentally on track but has multiple gaps in memory and cognitive association, likely due to prolonged stress and possible neglect. Since living with Mr. Yamada, she has demonstrated significant improvement in stability, emotional regulation, and attachment. She feels safe with him. She trusts him. Do you believe she should remain in his care?
Yes. Without hésitation.
The judge nodded, then looked at Ellie. Would the minor like to speak? Ellie looked up at Richard, who gave her a small nod. Then she stood. The courtroom fell still. My name is Ellie, she began, her voice quiet but clear. I didn't always know that. For a long time, I didn't know my real name.
Mama bête Khaled me Émilie. Sommetim lassait.
It changed depending on who was around. Nathan stirred in his seat, but the judge held up a hand for silence. She said I was special. That no one else wanted me. That if I ever ran away, people would take the babies and put them in cages. Ellie took a shaky breath. But then I met Baba. He didn't ask me who I was. He just helped me. He gave me food. A bed. He didn't touch me. He didn't yell. He let me name the babies and helped me feed them. When I cried, he stayed. That's all. He stayed. Her voice broke slightly at the end, and Richard had to clench his hands together to keep from walking to her. Judge Keene looked moved, though her tone remained steady. Thank you, Ellie.
You may sit down.
Ellie returned to her seat, and Richard reached out, resting his hand lightly over hers. Nathan's lawyer requested a recess to gather additional documentation, but the judge denied it. The court has heard sufficient preliminary evidence. Given the child's testimony, the expert witness statements, and the photographic and genetic documentation provided, I am prepared to issue a temporary ruling. Everyone in the room held their breath. I am granting emergency guardianship of the minor child, Ellie Mae Dawson, to Mr. Richard Yamada pending a full custodial review. A follow-up hearing will be scheduled within 60 days. Any attempts to contact or remove the child by parties other than the petitioner will be considered a violation of court order. A beat of stunned silence followed her gavel's strike. Nathan's face tightened, but he said nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered. Somehow, word had leaked, perhaps through Cross's team. Microphones, flashbulbs, shouted questions. Mr. Yamada, is it true the girl was living off the grid? Is this an illegal adoption? Are you related to the late Daniel Yamada? Richard didn't stop to answer. He kept Ellie close to his side as they walked to the waiting car. Inside, away from the cameras, Ellie looked up at him. Did we win? For now, Richard said. But he's still out there. Richard nodded. Yes. And we're going to find out what he really wants. Ellie was quiet for a long moment. I think he wants the babies. Richard turned to her, startled. Why? Because Mama Beth said they were worth more.
The word struck like a bell.
Worth more. Not loved. Not safe. Not human. Just worth. Richard sat back in the seat, his mind already racing. This wasn't just a custody fight. It was the edge of something far darker. And it had only just begun. The days leading up to the formal custody trial passed with an uneasy quiet. Outside, spring crept into Seattle, cherry blossoms blooming in parks, the gray sky softening into a hopeful blue, but inside Richard's home, tension brewed beneath the surface. Each morning began the same, bottles warmed, twins bathed and changed, Ellie quietly helping with breakfast. But in Richard's study, stacks of documents, legal briefs and photographs formed a second kind of household, one built not on joy, but defense.
Charles Branton visited almost Delinao.
He came armed with updates and strategy. Nathan Cross's legal team is coming hard, he warned one afternoon, spreading out papers across the dining room table. They've subpoenaed Ellie's hospital records, even the original accident report from your brother's crash.
Richard scanned the report.
They're trying to question the chain of custody. Exactly. If they can cast doubt on Ellie's identity or suggest impropriety in how you found her, they weaken your standing.
Richard shook his head.
I have a DNA test. Her own testimony. And she remembers Cross. That has to count for something. It does. But remember, this isn't just about facts. It's about narrative. They're going to try to paint you as a wealthy man exploiting a traumatized child.
She's my niece.
I know. And if we prove Cross's connection to Bethany Doyle, it will change everything. But we need more than photos. We need someone willing to speak. That was the problem. Every lead they'd chased so far, former workers at Hope's Gate Ministries, caretakers from underground homes, even hospital employees, had either disappeared, refused to talk, or claimed no memory.
Firogne over dem like Annette. Until the phone rang one Tuesday evening.
Richard picked up on the second ring.
Yamada.
The voice on the other end was thin, trembling. Is this about Ellie? He stood. Who is this?
My name is Linda Harrington.
I worked for Nathan Cross. For Hope's Gate. I saw what they did. I saw her.
Richard sat back down, at Punding. Can you come forward? Silence.
Then, only if I can stay anonymous until the court date. I'll testify. But I'm scared. They watch everyone. I'll protect you, Richard said. I promise. The next morning, Linda met with Charles and signed an affidavit. Her statement was devastating. She confirmed that Nathan had funded and overseen multiple sanctuary homes for children, most of them unlicensed, unregulated, and used to house minors pulled from unstable families or trafficked through forged adoption records. Bethany Doyle, according to Linda, was one of the most trusted intermediaries. She was paid directly, in cash. Ellie had been in her care for nearly 6 years. She had papers for the twins too, Linda said. New names. Birth dates. I saw her file them before she disappeared. They weren't born in hospitals. They were born in the system Nathan built. With that, the case took on new weight. It was no longer just a custody battle, it was a probe into a criminal network. 2 days before the trial, the judge granted Charles's request for Linda to testify behind a screen and under sealed identity. The courtroom would be closed to the public. When the day arrived, Richard dressed Ellie in a soft green sweater, her favorite color. She looked small beside him as they entered the courthouse, but she walked steadily. She didn't ask if they would win. She didn't need to. She had already decided to be brave. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Nathan Cross sat flanked by 3 attorneys. He wore a deep blue suit, darker than before, and his expression was composed, but Richard could see the tension in his jaw. Judge Keene took her seat and began. We are here to determine permanent custodial rights regarding the minor Ellie Mae Dawson, also known as Emma Doyle. I remind all parties that per previous court orders, media access is restricted and courtroom testimony is protected. Richard's legal team presented their case first. Charles called Samantha Liu, who reiterated Ellie's trauma history, her progress in Richard's care, and her emotional bond with both Richard and the infants. Then came Linda. Behind a wooden screen, her voice shaking slightly, she recounted everything: how Nathan ran the sanctuary homes, how he had orchestrated the intake of children like Ellie, how the names were changed, how the records were manipulated. The courtroom was silent as she finished. I know what I did was wrong. But I couldn't watch him do it to her again. That girl deserves a real life. Nathan's team attempted to discredit her, calling her disgruntled, unstable, and unreliable. But the damage was done. Her testimony had opened the door for federal investigation. Prosecutors in the hallway were already making notes. Next, Nathan took the stand. He was calm, measured. I only ever wanted to help children. Ellie was abandoned. I gave her shelter. I gave her structure. What Mr. Yamada is doing, parading her trauma in public, is exploitation. Richard rose to his feet when called. On the stand, he said nothing rehearsed. No legal jargon. Just truth. I lost my brother and his wife 6 years ago.
I lost my niece.
I thought she was gone forever. Then one night, I found her under an overpass, holding 2 infants in the cold. She didn't ask for help. She just kept them warm. He paused. She didn't know her name. But I did. I looked in her eyes, and I knew. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Yamada. As the final arguments closed, the courtroom sat in stillness. Then came the ruling. In light of the overwhelming evidence, the testimony provided, and the best interests of the child, this court grants permanent guardianship of Ellie Mae Dawson to Mr. Richard Yamada. A breath escaped from Richard's chest. Ellie squeezed his hand. The judge continued. Regarding the unnamed infants currently in Mr. Yamada's care, the court orders protective custody under his supervision pending further investigation. A guardian ad litem will be assigned, and background research will be initiated to determine origin and potential family claims. Nathan Cross stood abruptly. His face had turned white. This isn't over, he muttered. Richard turned to face him. No. It's just beginning. Outside, the media was waiting. This time, Charles stepped forward to make a statement. No comments on the investigation. The children are safe.
That is what matters.
Richard didn't stop to speak. He walked Ellie to the car, held the door open, and sat beside her in the back. You did it, she whispered. No, he said. We did it. The ride home was quiet. When they arrived, Max and Lily were asleep in the nursery, unaware of the battle that had been fought for them. That night, Ellie left a note on Richard's desk. In her small, careful handwriting, it read,
You gave me a name.
Then you gave me back my story.
Richard sat in the dark, reading the word over and over.
And for the first time in 6 long years, he cried, not out of grief, but gratitude. The morning after the custody ruling, Richard expected peace. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to sleep past dawn. The storm had passed, and in its place came a quiet, sunlit morning. Ellie was already up, playing with Max and Lily in the living room, building towers out of colorful wooden blocks. Richard stood by the doorway, coffee in hand, simply watching. He felt a peace he hadn't known in years.
Then came the knock on the door.
It wasn't frantic. Just 3 firm, deliberate taps. Richard opened it to find a woman standing there, mid-30s, dressed in gray slacks and a navy blazer, with a lanyard bearing the logo of Washington State's Department of Child Welfare. Mr. Yamada? She asked. Yes.
My name is Valérie Chen.
I'm the court-appointed guardian ad litem for the 2 infants in your custody. May I come in? Richard stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. Valerie greeted Ellie kindly, crouched down to coo at the twins, and then turned her attention back to Richard. I've read through the court files, she said. Your care of the children has been exceptional. But as part of the process, I'll need to conduct home visits, collect background reports, and begin searching for any possible familial ties for the twins. I understand, Richard said. But I have reason to believe they were trafficked, or at the very least removed from their birth parents illegally. I saw the affidavit from the whistleblower, Valerie nodded. We're taking it seriously. The state is working with the FBI. But these things take time. Before she left, she handed Richard a file folder. Inside were forms, contact numbers, and preliminary steps for filing for adoption, should it come to that. Ellie sat on the couch after Valerie had gone, hugging her knees to her chest. Are they gonna take Max and Lily away? She asked.
Richard sat beside her.
Not if I can help it. But what if their real parents want them?
Et hésitait-elle.
Then we'll make sure they're safe. That's the only thing that matters. That night, Richard stayed up late reviewing old notes and records. Something about Bethany Doyle's movements in the years after the accident didn't add up. She'd stayed under the radar too well. But someone had helped her. Someone with money and reach. At 1:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. A message.
Unknown number.
You took her. We're taking her back. He sat upright, cold dread creeping down his spine. He ran to Ellie's room. Empty. The bed was still warm. The window was open. He called out her name. No answer. He checked the nursery. Max and Lily were still there, unharmed. The front door hadn't been forced.
No alarme triggered.
He called 911. By the time police arrived, he'd already reviewed the security footage. At 12:47 a.m., a black SUV had pulled up outside the house. A man in a ski mask approached the side window. Ellie had opened it, climbed out, and gotten into the car. Voluntarily. Richard sank into the living room couch as officers questioned him. She wouldn't leave without a reason, he said over and over. Detectives searched the property, reviewed the footage, and began canvassing the area. The SUV's plates had been obscured. No known eyewitnesses. Richard's calls to Charles, Samantha, and Valerie went out before sunrise. By noon, the story had broken on local news. Prominent businessman's niece vanishes hours after custody granted. Speculation swirled. Was she taken by Cross's people? Had she run away? Had the trauma finally broken her? But Richard didn't believe it. Ellie had looked happy that morning. She'd kissed the twins' foreheads. She'd hummed while making breakfast. This was planned. And she had been manipulated. That evening, as Richard sat at his desk, his phone lit up again.
Unknown number.
No caller ID. He answered. Ellie. A pause. Then a voice, not Ellie's.
She's fine.
For now. If you want her back, drop the investigation. Close the case. Sign away custody of the twins. Walk away. Richard's hand clenched around the phone. Let me talk to her. The line went dead. The FBI took over within the hour. Agent Maria Downey, a sharp-eyed investigator with a reputation for uncovering deep trafficking rings, arrived at Richard's home. I've read the files, she said. This is bigger than custody.
You were right all along.
Then why hasn't anyone been arrested? Because the people behind this don't exist on paper. They use shell non-profits, false identities, off-the-books homes. We've been chasing this network for years. Then let me help you. She raised an eyebrow. You're a businessman, not a cop. I'm also the only one they've contacted. I'm in their crosshairs. Use that. Maria nodded slowly. All right. But if we're doing this, we do it my way.
You follow every protocol.
No heroics. Richard agreed. The next day, a second message arrived. A video. Ellie sat in a dimly lit room, wearing the same sweater she had worn to court. She looked tired, but not harmed. Her voice trembled as she spoke.
I'm okay, Baba.
They said if you stop asking questions, I can come home.
Please don't make them angry.
Then the video cut to black. Richard watched it 10 times. Studied her tone. Her eyes. She wasn't afraid for herself, she was afraid for him. They'd told her something. They'd made her believe walking away was the only way to keep them all safe. He showed the video to Maria. She's being used as leverage, the agent said. Classic tactic. But this gives us more. Look at the background. That logo on the wall. That's from a building outside Spokane we raided last year. The shell organization folded, but the building's still owned by a cross subsidiary. They prepared a sting operation. But Richard wasn't allowed to come. Not directly. Maria was firm. You've done enough. Let us do the rest. So he waited. And waited. It wasn't until 3 days later, in the early hours of the morning, that the call came. She's safe, Maria said. We got her. Richard drove to the safe house where Ellie had been taken. When she saw him, she burst into tears, running into his arms. I'm sorry, she sobbed. They said they'd hurt you. I thought, if I left they'd stop. He held her tightly.
You're safe now.
And you never have to run again. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The web was still out there, Cross, Doyle, and whoever else had been part of it. Still that night, as Ellie slept in his arms in the back seat, Richard looked out at the road ahead. They had taken her once. They would never take her again. For the first time since the night Ellie disappeared, the house felt like it could breathe again. It was subtle at first, a deep exhale of stillness in the hallways, the twins' soft coos echoing off the nursery walls, the gentle creak of wooden floors underfoot as Richard paced. Life resumed its rhythm. But it carried something new this time, a quiet undercurrent of fire. Ellie was safe. Physically, at least. But the shadows behind her eyes hadn't left. She flinched at unexpected knocks. She double-checked windows before bed. She kept asking the same question in different ways. What if they come again? Richard never had the perfect answer. He only said what he believed, they won't. Because this time, they're the ones being watched. Federal agents had begun to build their case. Maria Downey worked out of a temporary field office nearby, with Richard supplying everything he could, documents, timelines, call logs, even his own handwritten notes.
And then there was Linda Harrington.
The former employee of Hopesgate had agreed to testify again, this time not just in family court, but before a federal grand jury. Maria arranged for a safe house. Richard offered to fund her legal protection. Linda declined it all. I kept quiet for too long, she said when they met again in a small government office.
This time, you want my name attached to the truth.
She looked older than her 42 years. Worn from guilt. But beneath that was resolve. Maria briefed them both. Linda's testimony is the key. It connects Cross to the trafficking operations. It gives us motive, method, and access. Linda pulled out a folder from her coat. Inside were old ledgers, handwritten receipts, and memos she'd smuggled out years ago, documents that, until now, had seemed too dangerous to reveal. There were payments to homes across Washington, Oregon, even Idaho, she said.
Doyle managed 300 différents names.
I have addresses. I have intake forms. Children came in with no paperwork. They left with new names.
Richard scanned the record. And the twins.
I remember seeing them. The boy was sick. Doyle said he'd fetch a higher donation if we made him look urgent. She dressed them up for photos, created fake backstories. But something changed after Ellie showed up.
Doyle got paranoid.
Said someone from the family was asking too many questions.
The family?
Maria asked. Linda nodded. That's what they called the top of the chain. I never met them. Only Cross did.
Maria leaned forward.
So Cross wasn't the head?
No. Just the middleman.
But he knew enough to build a network. And he kept records, in a private server in his Arizona office.
Richard stood.
We can get that. I know someone inside his old company.
Maria raised a hand.
We'll take care of it. No more risks for you. We'll issue a subpoena and seize the server legally. But Richard wasn't thinking legally anymore. That night, he called Charles Brenton. I want to open a foundation, Richard said.
Charles hesitated.
For Ellie. For the others. For every child caught in that system.
You want something permanent. Not just a headline.
Not just a trial. I want funding, lawyers, investigators.
You want a war chest.
Charles nodded. We'll draft the articles of incorporation. You have the resources. I'll find the right people. By morning, the paperwork for the Dawson Light Foundation was underway. Meanwhile, Ellie returned to school, quietly, under an alias, in a small private program for children with trauma histories. It was her idea. I want to feel normal, she said. Richard drove her every day, waited outside every afternoon. He didn't let her out of his sight unless Maria confirmed it was safe. Then one afternoon, as he waited in the car reading over Linda's notes again, a name leapt off the page.
St. Helena's Recovery Shelter, Portland, Oregon.
He'd seen that name once before, on a list of donors from a gala hosted by Cross years ago. But Linda's notes showed something else. It wasn't just a donor. It was a funnel. Children were placed there. Moved again after 72 hours.
No official record.
No state inspections. He called Maria. We missed one, he said. And I think Cross is still using it. Maria met him at the federal building an hour later. You can't go there, she said. If you show up, they'll burn everything before we get a warrant. Then get the warrant. We need a judge. It could take days. Children could be moved in hours.
Maria exhaled sharply. You don't stop, do you?
I stopped once, Richard said. 6 years ago. I didn't look for Ellie when I should have. I won't make that mistake again. That night, a federal raid was authorized under emergency jurisdiction. Maria led it herself. By dawn, St. Helena's was shut down. 17 children were found. 5 had no names. 3 had pending custody orders from other states. 2 were infants. All were taken into protective custody. Cross's involvement hadn't yet been proven, but the walls were closing. And then, finally, the break came. The subpoenaed server from Cross's Arizona office revealed a trove of encrypted files.
Memo.
Bank transfers.
Audio recording. One stood out.
A voice, clear, male, confident, speaking into a phone. The girl's worth more if no one remembers her. That's the point. We erase, we rebrand, we relocate. By the time they ask questions, she's someone else.
Richard froze.
It was Nathan's voice. Maria looked at him. We have enough. A federal warrant was issued. 2 days later, Nathan Cross was arrested in a Denver hotel while attempting to board a private jet. The charges: child endangerment, conspiracy, trafficking, obstruction of justice, and fraud. News broke across every major network. The headlines were explosive. Charity CEO arrested in national child trafficking case. Seattle businessman uncovers network after rescuing niece. Dawson Light Foundation opens hotline for anonymous tips. Ellie watched it unfold from the living room, wrapped in a blanket, Max and Lily sleeping beside her. They got him, she whispered. Richard nodded. They did. But there's more to come. She looked at him. Can I help? He turned to her, surprised. You already have. She shook her head. No. I mean help the others. Like me. I want to write our story. Maybe someone like me will read it. Richard smiled. That's a good idea. And I'll help you tell it. The past couldn't be undone. But the truth had been pulled from the shadows, piece by piece, until it stood in the light. And now, finally, that light had a name. The federal courtroom was packed. Weeks had passed since Nathan Cross's arrest, and the headlines had only grown louder. Details of the trafficking network were slowly unveiled in the media, drawing nationwide outrage. Donations to the newly formed Dawson Light Foundation surged. Calls from other survivors, some now adults, some still missing, flooded the anonymous tip line. But for Richard, none of it meant closure. Not yet. This morning he stood at the front of a courtroom not as a plaintiff, nor a grieving relative, but as a guardian, a protector, and the man who had refused to walk away. Ellie sat just behind him, dressed simply, a pencil tucked into her notebook. She had taken to writing every day, chronicling the days she could remember, and imagining the ones she couldn't.
On the other side of the room sat Nathan Cross.
His once pristine suit now slightly wrinkled, jaw tight, eyes focused but unreadable. He no longer held the aura of control. The mask had cracked. The prosecution's opening was firm, focused, methodical. Assistant U.S. Attorney Carla Vasquez laid it out piece by piece. Wire transfers. Unlicensed homes. False identities.
Audiophile.
The paper trail was undeniable. Every dollar, every forged form, every silenced whistleblower, catalogued and presented.
Linda Harrington testified again.
This time without the screen. I should have come forward sooner, she told the jury. But I was afraid. And people like Cross count on that fear. Her words struck something deeper than fact. They struck moral resonance. The room listened, not just with ears, but with conscience. Next came the forensic accountant, who walked the jury through shell companies and offshore accounts used to launder money tied to child trafficking. And finally, Maria Downey. She described the sting, the evidence recovered, and the statements from children taken from homes connected to Cross's operations. When it was the defense's turn, Nathan's lawyers tried a different tactic. They leaned on deniability.
My client fondait d'orphanage initiative.
He trusted the wrong people, the lead defense attorney said. He did not traffic children. He donated money. He was misled. Nathan himself took the stand. I regret trusting Bethany Doyle, he said. I regret that I didn't vet her more thoroughly. But I never harmed a child. I never took anyone's daughter.
Richard sat unmoving.
Ellie didn't flinch either. She simply wrote a word in her notebook and circled it 3 times. Lies. The trial lasted 2 more days. Then came closing arguments. The prosecution was clear. Nathan Cross didn't just look the other way. He built the road they walked on. He built it to profit. He built it with intent. The defense responded with a plea for doubt. Don't punish a man for what others did in his name. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Richard waited at home, watching Ellie read to the twins in the sunlight of the living room, the weight of uncertainty hanging over them all. Then the call came. The verdict was in.
Back in the courtroom, tension humide like a wire pulled too tight.
The jury filed in. The judge asked for the verdict. The 4 persons stood. On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. Nathan didn't react. Richard exhaled, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Nathan faced up to 60 years in prison. After the hearing, the press swarmed. Richard gave no statements. He held Ellie's hand and walked her straight to the car. That night, after the twins were asleep, they sat on the back porch, wrapped in blankets.
Deux it fil au vert?
Ellie asked. No, Richard said. But it feels quieter. She looked up at the stars. I want to meet someone else.
Someone like me.
You will, he said. We've already had a dozen families reach out. The foundation is starting a support program. Will they be scared? Maybe. But they won't be alone. Ellie was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her notebook. She flipped to the last page and handed it to him. At the top, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, was a single line. What we remember makes us survivors. What we share makes us healers. Richard felt something catch in his chest. You wrote this? She nodded. I want it to be the first sentence in our book. Our book. Yeah. The story. All of it. He smiled, feeling the deep, anchoring joy of her presence. Then that's where we'll begin. The following week, Richard made it official. Max and Lily, now legally renamed under the surname Dawson, were adopted under emergency provisions.
Nos births parents came forward.
Their origins remained unclear, but their future had been chosen, with Ellie with Richard, and with a name that stood for something new. The Dawson Light Foundation opened its first satellite office in Portland. Linda was appointed Director of Survivor Outreach. Maria joined the advisory board. Families who had adopted under questionable circumstances came forward to verify documents. A new federal task force was created, named after Ellie's testimony, under the codename Room of Light. In every courtroom, every classroom, every quiet home where a child waited to be seen, the impact of what Ellie had survived, and what Richard had chosen to fight for, began to ripple outward. But they didn't talk about legacy. Not yet. That night, Ellie stood by the window of her bedroom, looking out at the lake. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you didn't stop that night? She asked. Richard paused in the hallway. Every day. Me too. He stepped into the room, placed a hand on her shoulder. But I did stop, he said. And you were there. And now we're here. She turned to him. I think I'm ready. For what? To speak. Not just in court. To others. Maybe in a video. Maybe at the foundation. People need to know what happened. Richard looked at her, not the broken child he'd found beneath an overpass, but the girl who had chosen to speak truth to silence. Then let's help them hear you.
The Foundation's media team arranged a small recording session.
No stage. No lights. Just Ellie in a chair, holding her notebook. She read from it slowly, her voice calm.
My name is Ellie Mae Dawson.
When I was 3, I was taken. When I was 9, I was found. When I was 10, I learned the truth. And now, I want to help others do the same. Because no one should be forgotten. The video went viral in days. Not because of production, but because of honesty. Ellie wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice. And that voice, steady, quiet, and unmistakably brave, was finally being heard. By the time summer settled fully over Seattle, the city seemed transformed, though not in any way most people would notice. Tourists still milled around Pike Place Market, ferries still crisscrossed Puget Sound, and the overcast skies still broke into sun only when they pleased. But for those who had followed Ellie's story, for the growing number of families and survivors finding their voices through the Dawson Light Foundation, something had shifted. The silence, once oppressive and hidden behind bureaucracy, was now full of sound, names, truths, memories, and a growing resistance. Ellie's video had been viewed over 5 million times. News stations called. Foundations in other states reached out. Parents who had adopted children through unofficial networks began to re-examine their paperwork, their origins. And survivors, young and old, wrote to the foundation with quiet, heart-wrenching accounts of the homes they barely escaped, the names they were forced to forget, and the lives they were told they never deserved. Inside Richard's house, things felt different too. The kitchen, once a place of midnight coffee and silent grief, was now always busy, feeding the twins, preparing snacks for meetings, setting up Zoom calls with advocacy groups. The living room had become a headquarters of sorts, filled with laptops, whiteboards, sticky notes, and stacks of printed letters from people all over the country. Ellie sat at the center of it, not as a symbol, but as a force. Each morning, she reviewed the letters. Some she read out loud. Some she folded gently and tucked away in her notebook. She had developed a habit of assigning names to unnamed children, soft, kind names like Grace, Micah, or Willow. "These names are like seeds," she once told Richard. "They need light to grow." One morning, as they sat over breakfast, Charles Brenton arrived with an envelope. "It's from the Department of Justice," he said, placing it on the table. "The final sentencing terms for Nathan Cross." Ellie didn't say a word. Richard opened it slowly. Count 1, human trafficking, guilty, 30 years. Count 2, conspiracy, guilty, 15 years. Count 3, obstruction, guilty, 10 years. All sentences to be served consecutively.
No parole.
No appeal.
A full effectim, behind bar. Elias eyes scanned the paper.
Then she looked out the window. "I don't feel happy," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "Justice isn't the same as healing." "I just thought."
Idée feel différent.
"You do," he said.
Juste note aux latons.
Later that week, they held the first Survivor Roundtable at the Foundation's new Seattle office. It wasn't a press event, or a public forum. Just a circle of chairs, a table of tea and fruit, and 6 people brave enough to come and sit in that room. Ellie opened the session.
My name is Ellie.
Some of you know my story. Some of you have stories I haven't heard. Today isn't about headlines. It's about remembering what they tried to erase. One woman, in her 20s, spoke first. Then a man in his 30s, quiet, hands shaking. A teenager who had been found in a home across state lines just weeks earlier. A mother who had unknowingly adopted a child through one of the forged networks, and now carried the weight of both love and betrayal.
Richard sat in the back, listening.
It felt sacred. Like stepping into a cathedral built not of stone, but of vulnerability. The stories didn't resolve. They didn't end neatly. But they opened something. After the session, one of the older survivors approached Richard. "Ellie's going to change everything," she said. "I hope so," he replied. "She already has." The following month brought new revelations. The FBI uncovered several overseas accounts linked to Cross's operations. One led to a shell organization in Eastern Europe, suspected of laundering payments for adoptions. Another was tied to a defunct religious non-profit in South Africa. Both had received donations within weeks of children being reported missing in the U.S. International task forces were engaged. Arrests were made abroad. Slowly, a global pattern began to form, a vast decentralized network hiding behind piety and charity. Back in Seattle, the Dawson Light Foundation released its first public report. It listed 214 suspected cases linked to the homes operated by Nathan Cross and Bethany Doyle. 42 had been confirmed as illegal adoptions. 9 children were still missing. Ellie read the report. Then she wrote 9 names in her notebook. "They deserve to be looked for," she said. "Even if no one else remembers them." Richard agreed. He funded a private search team with forensic investigators and outreach specialists. Within weeks, 2 of the missing children were located, now teenagers, living under false names in Florida and Arizona. Both were returned to safe guardianship. The ripple continued. Meanwhile, Ellie continued her writing. Her notebook had become a manuscript. With the help of a small publishing house, she and Richard began crafting it into a memoir, not a story of just what was taken, but what was rebuilt. The title came from a line Ellie had written on the final page.
Where the light returns.
Richard asked her one evening what the title meant. She looked at him, then around the room where Max and Lily were now playing with blocks, where drawings covered the walls and the smell of dinner filled the air. "It's the place where people stop looking at you like you're broken," she said. "It's the moment someone sees you and doesn't flinch. The place you go back to, even if you were never there before."
It's where the light comes back after the dark.
Richard nodded. Then I think a lot of people are still looking for that place. Then we'll build it, she said. One story at a time. That night, she left the notebook on his desk. Inside the cover was a dedication. For Bobber, who didn't ask who I was. He just stayed. Richard closed the notebook and sat in silence for a long while.
The war wasn't over.
There were still trials, hearings, missing names, and open wounds. But in this house, in this family, something had healed.
Nos tolatons.
Not completely, but enough.
Enough for now.
Autumn arrived gently that year, as if the wind itself had learned to tiptoe. The leaves in Seattle began their slow transformation, fiery reds and deep golds spilling across sidewalks, trees shedding like memories. In Richard's home, the change in season brought with it a rare stillness, not of silence but of balance. It was the first autumn since Ellie had come back, since the twins had been rescued, since the war had moved from behind closed doors into the open. And though there was still much to do, Richard felt something inside him settle. The house had changed too. Where once it had been sleek and cold, now it carried warmth in its corners, handprints on glass doors, children's shoes by the staircase, a bulletin board full of school drawings and crayon-written notes. The piano, untouched for years, now sat with music sheets open. Ellie had insisted on learning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to reclaim sound, her sound. Each morning began the same, breakfast at the kitchen table, the twins giggling in their high chairs, Ellie slowly mastering toast without burning it. Richard would pour coffee, make his notes, and glance through the foundation's emails. But every day, he paused for at least 10 minutes. To sit. To listen. To watch the life that had somehow found its way back to him. On a clear Friday morning, the mail brought a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, one Richard hadn't seen in over a decade. It was of his brother Daniel and his wife Evelyn, holding baby Ellie in a park, her mouth open mid-laugh, her fingers tangled in her father's hair. There was a note on the back.
Some memories survivent.
Some are returned. I thought you should have this. There was no signature. But Richard had a hunch. Somewhere, someone had kept pieces of Ellie's life safe. Maybe Bethany Doyle wasn't the only one who'd seen her as more than a transaction. Maybe among the darkness, a few lights had flickered, waiting to be found. That weekend, Ellie was invited to speak at the Northwest Children's Justice Summit, an annual gathering of advocates, caseworkers, and survivors. It would be her first appearance in front of a public audience. No pre-recorded video. No screen. Just her, a microphone, and a story the world had only glimpsed. Richard was nervous, but Ellie wasn't. She wore a simple green dress and her hair pinned back with one of Evelyn's old barrettes. She carried her notebook as she stepped on stage, small but certain. I used to think my name didn't matter, she began, because it changed so many times. Emily. Lassé. Jane. For a long time, I didn't know who I was. I only knew I had to keep quiet. A pause. But one day, someone didn't ask me for my name. He asked if I was cold. He asked if I was hungry. And when I couldn't speak, he stayed anyway. That was the beginning. The room fell into a deep silence. I learned that your story doesn't begin when someone hurts you. It begins when someone sees you. Really sees you.
Richard Listenet from the front row, eyes brimming.
Ellie closed her notebook.
My name is Ellie Maedoson. I'm not what happened to me. I'm what he chose after.
The standing ovation was long. Not for the eloquence, though it was there. Not even for the bravery, though that filled every word. But for the truth. Unvarnished.
Indéniable.
Spoken by someone who had once been taken, and who had now taken back her voice. After the summit, the foundation saw a wave of new involvement. Young survivors asked to volunteer. Lawyers offered pro bono services. Therapists signed up for the trauma-informed training programs the foundation had started. A seed, once barely sprouting, had now become a tree with its own branches. In the months that followed, Richard made a decision he hadn't expected. He stepped down as CEO of the Dawson Light Foundation. Not because he was tired, but because it was time. Time for new voices to lead. Ellie was too young, of course, but a board of directors had been formed, diverse and fierce in their commitment. Linda Harrington became executive director. Maria Downey continued as a legal liaison with federal cases. And Richard remained on as founder emeritus, still present, still guiding, but no longer holding the reins. He spent more time at home, with the twins now toddling and babbling in sentences. With Ellie, who had become not only a sister to them, but a young woman shaping her world with words. Her memoir was in its final editing stages, set for release the following spring. A few publishers had shown interest, but Ellie insisted it be printed through the Foundation's own press. "It should belong to us," she said, "not to someone who just wants to sell the pain." Richard agreed. One evening, as the family sat around the dining table, now cluttered with spaghetti bowls, coloring books and bottles, Ellie looked up and asked a question that silenced the room. "Do you think we're a real family?" Richard put down his fork.
What do you think?
She looked at the twins. At him. At the worn edges of the table where time had carved its presence. "I think we chose each other," she said. "That's more real than anything." Richard leaned forward and touched her hand. "Then yes. I think we're a family." That night, after the children were asleep, Richard stood at the window and looked out over the lake. The moon was full.
The air crisp.
Somewhere behind him, a quiet piano note played, Ellie, practicing again. He didn't feel like a hero. Or a savior. He felt like a man who had once driven down a road in the rain and made the only decision that mattered. He stopped. And because he did, a girl lived.
Tout enfant found a home.
A network collapsed. A movement began. In a world full of noise and forgetting, he had chosen to remember. To see. To stay. That would never be erased. As the wind stirred the trees outside, Richard whispered, not to anyone present, but to the memory of those lost. "We brought her back. And she brought us forward." And in the stillness, there was no reply. Only peace.